For years, the night sky had seemed calm to most people on Earth. Stars sparkled in quiet patterns, planets moved in predictable paths, and the vast emptiness beyond was something that only scientists and dreamers thought about. But far beyond, the orbit of Neptune, something unusual was happening. Something that very few humans had noticed, but that would change everything if it was ever fully understood. Deep in space, in the remote corners of the solar system, strange signals had been appearing for years. At first they were faint, almost too weak to detect. A soft, repeating rhythm of pulses that came and went like whispers in the dark. Most scientists dismissed them as nothing more than natural cosmic interference. Space dust, solar winds, random fluctuations. But there was a small group of observers, working in secret in military and scientific observatories, who believed the signals were something else. Something intelligent. They called it the Silent Watchers. The name reflected the eerie nature of the signals, steady, precise, and deliberate, yet impossible to see or touch. These watchers didn't announce themselves. They didn't send greetings or warnings, they simply waited. For what, no one could say, and because their signals were so subtle, no one outside a handful of high-security agencies even knew they existed. The observatories tasked with monitoring these signals were not ordinary spaces on Earth. They were underground, shielded from the world above. Their rooms were lined with blinking consoles, screens filled with data streams, and walls of satellite feeds tracking every inch of the outer solar system. Every day, analysts would pore over the faint signals, running calculations and comparisons, trying to understand their rhythm. It was like listening to a heartbeat of something unknown, far away. The people monitoring the signals didn't know exactly what they were looking for. They weren't sure if it was a natural phenomenon, a distant star acting strangely, or perhaps a new type of technology that no human had yet discovered. What they did know was that the signals were far too regular to be random. There was a pattern, a method, and patterns in space rarely happened by chance. Meanwhile, on Earth, life went on as usual. People looked up at the stars, often unaware that something was watching them back. Most people were too busy with daily life to notice the faint signs of intelligence beyond their world. Governments focused on problems closer to home: politics, economics, climate changes, and scientific research that could be applied immediately. Space had become a place of curiosity for the public, but for most, it remained a distant and untouchable void. But for the small teams monitoring the signals, the silence of space was not comforting. It was a warning. Every once in a while, the signals would shift slightly, as if the watchers were testing or measuring or perhaps just communicating in a way humans could not yet understand. Those moments made the observers uneasy. They knew that space was full of mysteries, but this felt different. It felt alive. Inside one of the monitoring stations, a group of analysts sat around a large console. The room was quiet except for the hum of the machines and the soft tapping of keyboards. Each of them had spent years studying space phenomena, yet none of them had ever seen anything quite like this. They compared notes, exchanged theories, and sometimes argued heatedly. Some believed the signals were a message meant for humanity. Others thought the watchers were simply observing, like scientists observing ants in a colony, taking measurements and making calculations without interference. The head of the station leaned over the main console. His eyes were tired from hours of staring at screens, but there was a spark of excitement mixed with concern. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of pulse patterns on the screen. "They're aligning with the orbital paths of Neptune's moons. That can't be a coincidence." Others leaned closer. The patterns were intricate, precise, almost mathematical. Each signal seemed to anticipate the movement of the moons before they happened, as if the watchers had knowledge that went far beyond human science. No telescope, no satellite, could have captured this level of detail from so far away. And yet, the signals matched perfectly. The analysts knew that this discovery, if it were ever made public, would shake the world. People had always wondered if humanity was alone in the universe. Many believed we were. Others hoped we weren't. But this This was proof that something intelligent existed in the dark spaces beyond our reach. Something that had been there, quietly observing for years. Outside the station, night fell over the barren landscape. The cold wind carried the faint sounds of distant machinery and the occasional call of wildlife, a reminder that Earth was still very much alive even as humans reached for the stars. The observers felt small in comparison, aware that they were part of something much larger than themselves. They were witnesses to the beginnings of a revelation that could change humanity forever. Despite the excitement, there was a sense of caution. No one knew the intentions of the watchers. Were they friendly, curious, dangerous? Humanity had no way to communicate, no way to ask questions, and no way to defend itself if the watchers were hostile. The analysts were caught between awe and fear, understanding that this was not just a scientific mystery, but a potential turning point in human history. Days turned into weeks, and the signals continued, sometimes fading for hours before returning. Every time they appeared, the observers studied them with renewed intensity, hoping to detect a pattern that could reveal a message. Occasionally, a signal would seem to respond to changes in human activity, satellite adjustments, research transmissions, or even minor communication tests. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that the watchers were aware of humanity. In the midst of all this, a quiet bond formed among the team. They were no longer just colleagues. They were guardians of knowledge that could not yet be shared. Each of them understood the weight of their discovery, and each felt the responsibility that came with it. They debated whether to escalate their findings to higher authorities, knowing that the wrong word could cause panic or worse, provoke the watchers in ways no one could predict. Then, one night, a new pattern appeared, different from anything before. The pulse grew stronger, more deliberate, as if the watchers were trying to get the observers' attention. The screens lit up with a series of symbols, too complex to be random. The team held their breath. They were no longer just monitoring, they were being noticed. For the first time, a sense of urgency replaced the quiet curiosity that had filled the station for years. Humanity had been watching the stars, but now the stars were watching back. Every thought, every movement, every decision the team made felt heavier, more important. They understood that they were standing at the edge of something far greater than themselves, something that could change the very course of human history. And yet, even with the fear, there was hope. Perhaps these watchers were not a threat, but a chance, an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect with something beyond human understanding. The possibilities stretched endlessly, as vast and mysterious as the space itself. The night grew colder, and the screens continued to pulse with the watchers' signals. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply watched, listening to the faint whispers from the darkness, aware that everything humanity had known about the universe was about to be challenged. The silent watchers were patient, and so was humanity, though it did not yet know it. The research outpost known as Horizon Point had always been at the edge of human reach. Located far beyond the orbit of Neptune, it was a station built for observation, discovery, and survival. Its walls were thick, designed to withstand both the harsh vacuum of space and the small, unpredictable dangers that lurked in the void. Inside, scientists and engineers worked in shifts, monitoring distant stars, mapping planetary movements, and studying the faint signals that had begun to appear years before. Life on Horizon Point was lonely. The crew of the station lived in close quarters, their days dictated by strict schedules of research, maintenance, and communication. They had become experts at silence, not the quiet that comes naturally on Earth, but the eerie, oppressive silence of deep space. Every sound, every hum of machinery, every faint vibration of the station reminded them of how isolated they truly were. Despite the isolation, the crew had grown accustomed to routine. They laughed together during meals, shared stories during breaks, and supported each other through the long stretches of solitude. But the faint signals from beyond Neptune had always lingered in the back of their minds. They were a mystery that no one on Earth could solve. And now, in the middle of a long shift, the signals began to change. It started with a flash of light on one of the observation monitors. At first, no one noticed it. Then, a second flash appeared, followed by another, forming a pattern too precise to be random. The lead analyst froze, eyes glued to the screen. "That's not normal," they whispered. The room fell silent as others gathered around the monitor, watching the pulses of light dance in a sequence that felt almost like a code. For hours, the team tried to interpret what they were seeing. Each flash seemed to correspond to distant movements, subtle shifts in the cosmic background that no human equipment should have been able to detect. It was as if the signals themselves were alive, reacting to something beyond comprehension. The analysts ran simulations, cross-referenced the data with known celestial patterns, and even tried sending small test signals back toward the source. Nothing worked. The signals did not respond directly. They simply continued steady and deliberate, as if observing without interacting. It was both fascinating and terrifying. The team knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that could prove beyond doubt that humanity was not alone in the universe. Then, without warning, the station experienced a sudden, intense burst of energy. Lights flickered, alarms beeped, and screens went blank for a few tense moments. The crew scrambled to restore power and stabilize the systems. When the monitors finally came back online, the team realized that the signals had not only returned, they had changed dramatically. The pulses now formed shapes, geometric patterns that were unmistakably intelligent. No human, no known machine could produce such complexity. It was a silent message, but one that carried weight, purpose, and perhaps even intent. The team stared in awe, understanding that they were no longer mere observers. They were part of a conversation they could barely comprehend. The station commander quickly called a secure video link to Earth. The communication was shaky, delayed by the vast distance, but clear enough to convey urgency. Scientists, military officials, and engineers gathered on Earth to witness what Horizon Point had discovered. They were shown the data streams, the flashes, the patterns, and for the first time, many of them admitted something they had never said aloud. The universe was no longer quiet. As the hours passed, the signals began to interact with the station in subtle ways. Equipment behaved strangely. Computers processed data faster than expected. Sensors picked up anomalies in the surrounding space, small energy fluctuations that seemed to form invisible shapes like shadows of massive structures, far larger than anything humanity had ever built. The crew felt a mix of fear and awe. They were standing at the edge of something monumental, something that might change the course of human history forever. But with this discovery came doubt and uncertainty. Were these watchers friendly, or were they assessing humanity as a threat? Could the bursts of energy they had experienced be accidental, or were they deliberate tests? The crew had no way of knowing. Every decision, every action could have consequences they could not predict. Even a simple attempt to communicate could provoke a response they might not survive. Despite the danger, the crew pressed on. They worked tirelessly to decode the patterns, to map the energy bursts, and to understand the motives of the unseen observers. Days blurred into nights, though night on Horizon Point was only a shift in artificial lighting, a reminder of the human rhythm they tried to maintain in a place where the sun had little meaning. One morning, a new signal arrived, unlike anything before. It was louder, clearer, and seemed almost like a direct transmission. The crew gathered in the main observation hall, watching as the screen displayed an array of shapes that shifted and rotated in three-dimensional space. The lead analyst whispered, "It's a message. I think they want us to see it." The shapes were impossible to interpret fully. They were not language, at least not in any human sense. They were symbols, codes, and movements that suggested intelligence far beyond human understanding. And yet, despite the alien nature of the transmission, the crew could feel meaning in the patterns. There was a sense of awareness, of recognition. For the first time, it felt as though the watchers knew they were being observed. As the team studied the message, a sudden realization struck them. The signals were not random tests or experiments. They were deliberate, structured, and purposeful. Whatever entity or entities were sending them were aware of humanity's presence. They were measuring, assessing, and perhaps even judging. The commander paced the observation hall, trying to process what was happening. "We're not alone," they said quietly, more to themselves than anyone else. "And they know we're here." The room was silent except for the hum of the station's machinery, a reminder of how fragile human life was in the vast emptiness of space. Outside the station, the void stretched endlessly. Stars twinkled like distant candles. Planets orbited silently, and the solar system remained as it always had. But for the people inside Horizon Point, everything had changed. They were no longer simply explorers or scientists. They were witnesses to the first undeniable evidence that humanity was being observed by an intelligence far beyond its own. The crew worked through the day and into the night, trying to respond. They sent small, controlled signals back into space. Simple pulses, patterns designed to mimic the ones they had received. They watched the screens anxiously, hoping for any sign of recognition. Hours passed with no response, and tension grew. Each crew member felt the weight of their isolation more heavily than ever. They were not just far from Earth, they were far from understanding, far from safety, and far from certainty. And then finally, a subtle change appeared in the signals. One of the shapes shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to catch the attention of the analysts. The crew held their breath as the pattern repeated, forming what seemed like an acknowledgement. It was not a message in words, but it was communication nonetheless. The watchers were aware of them, and they had noticed humanity's attempt to respond. Excitement and fear mingled in the room. No one had ever imagined that first contact could happen in such a quiet, understated way. There were no explosions, no dramatic landings, no immediate threats, just the knowledge that another intelligence existed, and that it had chosen to observe and interact in ways humans could barely understand. The team understood that this was only the beginning. They had glimpsed a small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that stretched across space and time. Whatever lay beyond the signals, whatever the watchers truly were, humanity had entered a new chapter, a chapter where survival, understanding, and communication depended on courage, intelligence, and patience. The final moments of that day at Horizon Point were spent in quiet reflection. Crew members looked out at the stars, each lost in thought. They wondered about the intentions of the watchers, about the future of humanity, and about the countless possibilities that lay ahead. They felt small in the face of the universe, yet significant, because for the first time they knew they were being seen. And somewhere, far beyond Neptune, in the silent darkness, the watchers continued their vigil. They waited patiently, observing the humans who had finally noticed them. They did not reveal themselves fully, and they did not strike. But they had made their presence known, and that alone was enough to change everything. Humanity had taken the first step into a larger universe, a universe that was no longer quiet, no longer empty, and no longer unknowable. Horizon Point had become the bridge, the first link between two intelligences separated by distance, mystery, and the infinite vastness of space. And as the crew prepared for the long night ahead, they understood that the real challenge was just beginning. Learning to survive, communicate, and understand a presence far older and far wiser than anything humanity had ever imagined. The signals continued, steady and patient. The humans watched, and the universe, for the first time in human history, felt alive. For years, rumors had floated through the halls of Earth's military and scientific circles. They spoke of a project so secret that even most governments barely acknowledged its existence. It was called Project Helios, a massive effort to build a ship that could operate independently in deep space, far beyond the reach of Earth's fleets. Most people believed it was just a rumor, an exaggeration of plans for ordinary satellites or experimental craft. But for those who worked on it, it was very real, and it was unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. The Terran Battlecruiser, named Terran Resolute, was a symbol of both human ingenuity and human caution. Engineers and designers had labored, for decades to create a ship capable of long-term autonomous operation, with systems that could handle not only the vacuum of space, but also the unknown threats that might exist there. The ship was enormous, more than a kilometer in length, with fusion cores that produced power beyond anything previously built. Its armor was reinforced with experimental alloys, layered in ways that could absorb energy, resist impact, and even adapt to certain types of radiation. Yet despite its strength, the Terran Resolute was designed not for aggression, but for survival. Humanity had no desire to provoke or conquer. The ship was a safeguard, a way to ensure that if something unexpected appeared in the solar system, Earth would not be helpless. Its mission was one of observation, communication, and, if necessary, defense. The crew trained for every imaginable scenario, from catastrophic system failures to encounters with unknown life forms. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Every crew member understood the weight of their mission. They were pioneers not just in exploration but in representing the entirety of humanity to the cosmos. Every action they took would be scrutinized. Every choice mattered. There were no second chances. The preparation for the Terran Resolute's first voyage was meticulous. Every component, from the navigation systems to the food supply, was tested under extreme conditions. Simulations ran continuously, anticipating emergencies, ranging from mechanical failures to collisions with debris. Even the psychological state of the crew was monitored closely. Long-term isolation in deep space could strain the mind as much as the body, and the commanders were determined that no weakness would jeopardize the mission. Meanwhile, on Earth, the discovery of the signals from the outer solar system had added urgency to Project Helios. The observers at Horizon Point had detected patterns that suggested intelligence, patterns that hinted at something far older and more advanced than humanity. Project Helios had been designed for deep space reconnaissance, but now it had a more immediate purpose: to reach the outer rim, to study the Watchers directly, and if possible to establish contact. Launch day arrived after years of preparation. The world above was largely unaware of the true purpose of the mission, seeing only a routine display of scientific progress. Families, scientists, and officials gathered at secure observation centers, marveling at the enormous craft as it lifted off the Earth's surface. Even from a distance, the ship's size was awe-inspiring, a steel and alloy colossus moving gracefully into the black sky. Inside the Terran Resolute, the crew felt a mixture of excitement and solemn responsibility. Every system hummed smoothly. Every control responded as expected, and yet there was an unspoken tension. They were leaving the known safety of the inner solar system, moving toward a region where the rules of the universe seemed different. The signals from Horizon Point had prepared them in theory, but nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of deep space. As the ship traveled past the orbit of Jupiter, the first real tests began. Radiation levels fluctuated. Minor technical glitches appeared in sensors, and the crew was forced to adapt quickly. Every correction, every manual override, reinforced the crew's confidence in both their ship and their own skills. The Terran Resolute was more than a machine. It was a living extension of human determination, a vessel that carried the hopes and survival of an entire species. Weeks turned into months as the Battlecruiser moved steadily toward the outer reaches of the solar system. The signals detected by Horizon Point became stronger and more defined. The crew monitored them constantly, analyzing the patterns, mapping the energy bursts, and trying to anticipate what lay ahead. It was a delicate balance of caution and curiosity, of fear and determination. The first encounter with an anomaly occurred near a cluster of distant icy bodies. Sensors picked up a sudden spike in energy readings, unlike anything the crew had seen before. Lights flickered briefly across the command deck, and the ship's AI warned of an unidentified mass approaching. The crew acted immediately, running protocols designed for unknown objects. But when the readings stabilized, there was no visible threat, only a field of energy that seemed to pulse with intent. The analysts aboard realized that this field was not natural. Its structure was complex, almost organic in its rhythm. It reacted to the ship's presence, shifting and adapting in ways that suggested intelligence. The crew watched in awe, understanding that they were not alone, and that this was only the beginning. Days later, as the ship approached the coordinates suggested by Horizon Point, the first visual contact occurred. Through the observation windows, the crew saw shapes moving in space, massive, smooth, and flowing in patterns that defied human engineering. The Watchers, as they had been called at Horizon Point, were finally visible, and the sight left everyone speechless. They were not like anything humanity had imagined. Their surfaces shimmered with energy, shifting colors and forms as if alive. They moved gracefully without engines or exhaust, yet with purpose and coordination. The crew felt a mix of fear and fascination. Every instinct told them to retreat, to maintain a safe distance, but curiosity drove them closer. The Terran Resolute was built to withstand the unknown, and now it was being tested in ways that no simulation could replicate. The Watchers were observing, and it seemed they were aware of the ship's approach. Communication attempts began. The crew sent carefully designed pulses and patterns, mimicking those detected from Horizon Point. At first, there was no response. Then, subtle shifts occurred in the Watchers' formations, movements that mirrored the human signals. It was a slow, deliberate acknowledgement, a first step toward recognition. For the crew of the Terran Resolute, the experience was overwhelming. They were not just exploring, they were becoming participants in a dialogue with an intelligence that had existed far longer than humanity. Every observation, every cautious signal carried weight. The responsibility was immense, and yet the sense of wonder was equally strong. As the ship maintained its position near the Watchers, the crew continued to monitor and analyze. They discovered that the energy fields surrounding the Watchers were not merely defensive, they were communicative. Subtle fluctuations in energy corresponded with changes in the surrounding space, creating patterns that could be interpreted as messages. It was a complex living form of language, one that required patience, attention, and careful observation. The captain of the Terran Resolute addressed the crew. "Remember why we are here," they said. "We are not invaders, we are observers. We are representatives of humanity. Every decision we make matters, not just for us, but for everyone on Earth. Approach with caution, but do not let fear prevent understanding." The crew nodded, absorbing the gravity of their situation. They were aware that the Watchers had the ability to destroy them without effort, yet they did not act aggressively. It was a lesson in restraint, a demonstration of the patience and intelligence of a species far beyond humanity's current understanding. Over the following weeks, the Terran Resolute maintained its vigil. The crew documented every movement, every energy fluctuation, and every pattern that emerged from the Watchers. They became increasingly skilled at interpreting the subtle signals, recognizing that communication was possible, even if limited. Slowly, a bridge of understanding began to form, built on observation, patience, and respect. Yet despite the growing connection, unease remained. The Watchers had not revealed their intentions, and the crew had no way of knowing whether they were being evaluated, studied, or simply observed. Every action taken by the Terran Resolute could have consequences beyond comprehension. The tension was palpable, but the mission could not be abandoned. Humanity's survival, its chance to understand, depended on this encounter. The Terran Resolute had become more than a ship. It had become a symbol of human curiosity, resilience, and determination. It carried the weight of generations, the hopes of millions, and the potential for a new understanding of the universe. And as it drifted near the Watchers, silent yet alert, the crew understood that they were part of something far larger than themselves, a first step into a universe that had waited patiently for humanity to arrive. The Watchers continued their patterns, silent yet communicative, as if acknowledging the presence of humanity. And for the crew of the Terran Resolute, that acknowledgement was both terrifying and inspiring. They had reached the edge of the known solar system, and beyond it lay mysteries that would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The mission was only beginning. Humanity had sent its mightiest creation into the void, and it had been noticed. The Terran Resolute Y. The vast darkness of space stretched endlessly beyond the Terran Resolute, a sea of stars shining cold and distant. For months, the crew had approached the coordinates indicated by Horizon Point, navigating with careful precision, monitoring the Watcher's signals and preparing for what could be humanity's first direct encounter with an intelligence far older and far wiser. The anticipation was heavy, yet no one on board spoke of fear openly. They had learned to mask it, to focus on duty and observation. But in quiet moments, in the still hum of the ship's corridors, the weight of the unknown pressed down on every soul aboard. Then one day it happened. Through the observation windows, the crew saw them, massive vessels unlike anything human imagination had created. They glided effortlessly as if moving through water, though space held no such medium. Their surfaces shimmered with colors that shifted and changed in ways that seemed alive. The ships were enormous, far larger than the Terran Resolute itself, yet their movements were precise and deliberate. Each seemed to operate independently, yet as part of a single coordinated formation. The first reaction among the crew was awe. The shape, size, and motion of the alien vessels defied everything humanity had ever known about engineering and propulsion. Sensors could not detect conventional engines or heat signatures. The ships seemed to move as if propelled by thought, or intent alone. It was impossible to look away. The Watchers were no longer distant, mysterious signals. They were tangible, real, and breathtaking. The captain called for calm. "Everyone, stay focused," they said, their voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "We are here to observe, to understand, and to communicate. Every action matters." The crew obeyed, running the protocols they had rehearsed countless times. Sensors were calibrated to monitor the ship's energy patterns. Cameras and observation arrays focused on every angle, capturing the undulating surfaces, the flashes of light that ran across the vessels like ripples in water. Analysts in the observation room tried to make sense of the patterns, noting repetitions, anomalies, and correlations with the signals they had received at Horizon Point. Hours passed, with careful observation, and then the alien fleet did something extraordinary. A single vessel shifted, separating slightly from the formation, and began moving in a path that mirrored the Terran Resolute's maneuvers. It was not an attack, but a test, a subtle acknowledgement that the Watchers were aware of the human ship, measuring it, assessing it, and perhaps communicating in a language humanity could barely perceive. The crew felt a mixture of relief and tension. The Watchers were not immediately hostile, but the stakes were immense. Every decision, every adjustment of position, could provoke a reaction they could not anticipate. Communication was possible, but only if approached carefully, with precision, patience, and respect. The ship's lead analyst initiated a series of signal pulses, mimicking the patterns previously received at Horizon Point. The pulses were simple, deliberate, and designed to test recognition rather than convey meaning. Seconds passed, then minutes. The alien ship responded, not with words, not with gestures, but with changes in its energy patterns. It moved in ways that mirrored the human pulses, forming sequences that suggested acknowledgement and awareness. The observation room erupted, quietly, not with cheers, but with a shared sense of wonder. This was first contact. Not dramatic, not violent, not chaotic, but precise, deliberate, and intelligent. Humanity had been noticed, and in turn, had been recognized. As the Terran Resolute maintained its position near the alien ship, the crew began to detect other anomalies. The energy fields around the vessels interacted with the ship's sensors in complex ways, creating patterns that were both physical and symbolic. They were shapes in space, undulating flows of energy that seemed to form structures invisible to the naked eye. Analysts speculated that the Watchers might be communicating not through words, but through forms and energy patterns, a language built from physics, mathematics, and intuition. The realization was humbling. Humans had long thought of communication in terms of speech, writing, or images, but the Watchers were demonstrating a method of interaction far beyond simple words. It was a language of understanding itself, a system that required observation, patience, and careful interpretation. The crew of the Terran Resolute worked tirelessly to decode the patterns, noting subtle repetitions, changes, and variations that might indicate intent, meaning, or emotion. One of the crew members, responsible for signal analysis, noticed something remarkable. Certain pulses corresponded with the movement of nearby celestial bodies. It was as if the Watchers were showing knowledge of space and time far beyond human capabilities. They were demonstrating mastery over the environment, conveying information about regions, hazards, and phenomena in ways that humans could begin to understand. The captain held a meeting in the command deck. "We are seeing something incredible," they said. "These beings, whatever they are not hostile right now. They are communicating, teaching, or observing. Our role is to respond carefully, to document, and to learn. Remember, we are humanity's representatives." The crew nodded, aware that they were now part of a historical event that would be remembered for generations. Yet even as excitement and curiosity filled the ship, caution remained paramount. The Watchers' motives were unclear, and the consequences of miscommunication could be catastrophic. Over the next several days, the Terran Resolute and the alien ship maintained a delicate standoff. Neither fired weapons, neither made aggressive maneuvers, yet every movement was deliberate, every energy pulse measured. The humans began to recognize patterns in the Watchers' formations, noting that shifts and ripples in energy seemed to correspond with different types of response: interest, caution, curiosity. It was a silent dialogue, subtle yet profound. At one point, a new phenomenon occurred. One of the alien vessels emitted a pulse of light so intense that it briefly illuminated the Terran Resolute, casting long shadows across the deck. It was not harmful, but it was powerful, and it left the crew momentarily speechless. When analyzed, the pulse appeared to be a visual representation of data, a map of nearby star systems, some marked with symbols indicating activity or absence. The implication was staggering. The Watchers had seen civilizations before, and they were aware of which worlds had survived and which had not. The analysts worked around the clock to interpret the data. Patterns emerged that suggested intelligence far older and more experienced than humanity. The Watchers had studied the universe for millennia, observing countless species and systems, and now humanity had been added to their records, noticed, for the first time. Despite the overwhelming complexity, the crew of the Terran Resolute began to understand a basic principle. Patience, observation, and respect were key. The Watchers were not hostile, but they were not naive. Every action, every signal, every movement had meaning. Humanity could not rush this encounter. Missteps could end it, or worse. At night, or what passed for night aboard the Terran Resolute, crew members would gather at observation windows, staring at the alien vessels drifting silently in the void. There were no words to describe the sensation fully, just awe, fear, and wonder mixed into something greater. The universe had become alive in a way they had never imagined. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in the first interstellar dialogue humanity had ever experienced. Days turned into weeks. The Terran Resolute learned to mirror the Watchers' energy patterns with increasing accuracy, responding in ways that suggested comprehension. The alien vessels adjusted their formations, seemingly approving or acknowledging the human responses. Slowly, a bridge of understanding formed, not through words but through observation, energy, and motion. The crew realized that these interactions were a kind of test. The Watchers were measuring humanity's intelligence, patience, and ability to communicate without aggression. Every response mattered. The Terran Resolute was not just a ship, it was humanity's ambassador, and the crew its representatives. The stakes were immense, and yet there was a sense of possibility, of hope, that this encounter could mark the beginning of a new chapter for the human race. Finally, after days of careful observation, a new signal emerged. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the analysts recognized it immediately. A series of pulses repeated, forming a pattern that mirrored some of humanity's earliest attempts at communication. Numbers, sequences, simple visual, shapes. The watchers were responding not with words but with a deliberate acknowledgement of human effort. It was the first true response, a signal that said, in essence, "We see you. We know you are here." The atmosphere aboard the Terran Resolute was electric. Crew members exchanged glances of disbelief and quiet triumph. Humanity had been recognized. They were no longer isolated observers of the universe. They were now participants in a silent, profound dialogue with beings far beyond comprehension. Even as they celebrated internally, the crew remained aware of the danger. The Watchers' intentions were still unknown. Their knowledge and power far exceeded humanity's, and any misstep could have devastating consequences. Yet the knowledge that they had been noticed, and that they had responded with intelligence and patience, gave the crew hope. The alien fleet continued its silent movements. SciFi. The Terran Resolute drifted silently near the edge of the alien fleet's formation. For days, the ship had observed the Watchers, mirrored their energy patterns, and maintained a delicate balance between curiosity and caution. The crew had grown, accustomed to the constant hum of the ship, the flicker of screens, and the strange, almost alive pulses of energy from the alien vessels. Yet despite familiarity, there was always an underlying tension, a knowledge that at any moment the encounter could turn hostile. The alien ships, vast and shimmering, maintained a careful distance. Their presence was commanding yet silent, and their movements were precise, almost ceremonial. Every ripple of energy across their surfaces was noted, every subtle change in formation recorded by the Terran Resolute's analysts. For humanity, this was more than observation. It was learning a new kind of intelligence, one that existed in forms beyond speech or conventional thought. The crew began to notice a pattern in the fleet's behavior. The vessels occasionally emitted pulses that rippled outward, not as attacks, but as waves of information. When the Terran Resolute matched those pulses, slight adjustments occurred in the alien formations, as if approving the human response. Slowly, the crew understood that they were engaged in a dialogue, a slow, cautious, and fragile exchange of recognition. The captain called the crew to the command deck for a briefing. "We have been observed, and we are responding correctly," they said. "This is a standoff, yes, but it is also an opportunity. Our job is to maintain patience and show intelligence. Any misstep could have consequences we cannot predict." For the crew, every day was a test. Simple decisions like altering the ship's position by a few meters or changing the rhythm of the energy pulses carried weight. Each choice could signal confidence, respect, fear, or aggression. The crew became hyper-aware of their own actions, realizing that they represented not only the Terran Resolute, but the entire human race. One day, a particularly strong pulse radiated from the alien flagship. It wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniable. The energy wave enveloped the Terran Resolute, flowing over its hull and interacting with its shields in a complex dance of light and force. Sensors recorded fluctuations that defied human understanding, and the ship's AI struggled to interpret them. Yet the crew felt a strange sensation, not fear, but awareness, as if the fleet was communicating without words. Analysts studied the pulse carefully. Patterns emerged that resembled maps of star systems, some familiar, some unknown. Certain points were highlighted, while others were dim or silent. The interpretation was chilling. The Watchers had observed civilizations before, marking those that had survived and those that had vanished. Humanity was being measured, catalogued, and assessed. The implications were immense. The captain addressed the crew in a quiet but firm voice. "We are being tested, not attacked. Observe carefully. Learn from this. Our response will determine how they view us." Over the next hours, the Terran Resolute mirrored the energy patterns as precisely as possible. The crew worked in shifts, maintaining the signals with meticulous accuracy. Each ripple of energy, each pulse, was a conversation. Slowly, subtle, changes occurred in the alien fleet. They tightened their formation, shifted their energy flows, and occasionally emitted pulses that seemed to acknowledge specific human maneuvers. During one of these periods, the lead analyst noticed a new development. A smaller vessel broke formation and approached the Terran Resolute at a measured pace. It emitted a series of pulses that mirrored the ship's earlier transmissions almost exactly. The crew held their breath. This was a closer form of contact, a deliberate act of acknowledgement that carried far more significance than any distant observation. The alien ship did not attack. Instead, it hovered, its energy fields interacting with the Resolute's sensors in ways that suggested communication. Subtle patterns formed like shapes and symbols in three-dimensional space. Analysts debated whether these were messages, maps, or warnings. It was impossible to know for sure, but the crew understood that this was an invitation to continue the dialogue, to respond with intelligence and care. The Terran Resolute transmitted pulses in response, matching the rhythm and complexity of the alien signals. Slowly, the analysts detected changes in the energy field. Points of light moved, sequences repeated, and the alien ship appeared to acknowledge each successful response. The tension aboard the human vessel remained high, but the crew felt a growing sense of cautious hope. Humanity was not only being observed, it was being understood. Despite the apparent safety, the crew never let their guard down. Every system was monitored constantly, from shields to sensors, from communication arrays to life support. The alien fleet was powerful, beyond anything humanity could hope to match, yet its patience and restraint suggested intelligence that valued observation over destruction. The crew learned to respect that intelligence, to act with precision, and to remain calm under pressure. As hours turned into days, the fleet revealed more. Pulses of light displayed data in ways that challenged human understanding. Certain energy patterns corresponded to areas in space where life might exist, while others indicated regions of danger or inactivity. The Watchers had mapped the universe in ways humans could only begin to comprehend. They had cataloged countless civilizations, some long gone, and some thriving beyond detection. Humanity was now part of that record. The crew of the Terran Resolute realized something profound. The Watchers were teaching or perhaps testing humanity through observation and interaction. Every pulse, every ripple carried meaning. Every response, every mirrored signal contributed to an understanding that transcended words. Humanity was learning to communicate in a language built from patience, observation, and respect. Late one day, a particularly intense pulse arrived. The energy wave illuminated the observation deck, bathing the crew in brilliant light. Sensors interpreted the signal as a structured map, a visual representation of nearby star systems. Some systems were marked with points of interest, while others were highlighted in ways that suggested danger or caution. The message was clear. The Watchers had seen many civilizations, and they had chosen to observe humanity carefully. The analysts worked tirelessly to decode the signal. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The highlighted points suggested safe paths, areas of potential resources, and regions where caution was required. The alien fleet was providing information, not commands, but guidance, a subtle form of assistance that carried both warning and opportunity. The captain addressed the crew. "What we are seeing is remarkable. This is not an attack, nor is it random. They are acknowledging us, teaching us, and perhaps even preparing us for what lies ahead. Continue to respond with precision, and continue to observe carefully. We are part of something far larger than ourselves." The crew nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Humanity was no longer isolated. It had been seen, measured, and acknowledged by a species far older and far more intelligent. The Terran Resolute had become a bridge, a symbol, and a participant in a silent dialogue that would shape the future of human civilization. In the following days, the interactions continued. Pulses of light from the alien fleet conveyed increasingly complex patterns. The crew mirrored these patterns, sometimes successfully, sometimes imperfectly. Each successful response was met with subtle acknowledgement, a shift in formation, a ripple in the energy field, a brief flash of illumination. Each error was noted, corrected, and learned from. Humanity was being tested, but the test was not one of strength or firepower. It was one of patience, intelligence, and understanding. The alien fleet remained cautious yet deliberate. It moved in ways that suggested awareness, intent, and perhaps curiosity. The Terran Resolute maintained its position, careful not to provoke or interfere unnecessarily. The crew grew increasingly skilled at interpreting the pulses, recognizing that communication was possible, even if it was slow and subtle. Then, one final signal arrived. It was unlike any before, a long, deliberate pulse, structured and clear. Analysts worked quickly to interpret it, and what emerged was astonishing. The signal contained data about hundreds of nearby star systems, most marked with subtle indications of activity, life, or absence. It was as if the Watchers were sharing knowledge, providing humanity with insight into the wider universe. The crew understood the significance immediately. The Watchers were not only observing, they were teaching, warning, and guiding. Humanity had been measured, and now it had been acknowledged as a species capable of understanding, patience, and intelligence. The pulse ended with a simple, undeniable message. Humanity had been noticed, and it had been recognized. The Terran Resolute had succeeded in its mission. The alien fleet had not attacked, and it had not fled. Instead, it had communicated, observed, and perhaps even welcomed humanity into a wider understanding of the cosmos. The crew felt a mixture of relief, awe, and responsibility. They had been the first to bridge the gap between humans and an intelligence far older and wiser, and the weight of that achievement would stay with them forever. For the crew, the standoff had become a profound lesson. Power alone was meaningless without understanding. Strength without patience could provoke disaster, and intelligence, when tempered with restraint and respect, could open doors to knowledge beyond him. The Terran Resolute drifted through the darkness of deep space, following the subtle signals of the Watchers. For weeks, the ship had maintained its position near the alien fleet, responding to energy pulses, observing formations, and slowly learning the language of light and motion that defined the first interstellar dialogue in human history. Each day brought small victories. Successful pulses mirrored patterns, subtle acknowledgments, but also tension, the constant awareness that a single misstep could provoke disaster. The crew had grown adept at patience. Every shift, every observation, was now part of a delicate rhythm. They had learned to interpret even the faintest energy fluctuations, to notice tiny shifts in the alien formations, and to anticipate the subtle responses that followed. There was pride in their work, yes, but also a deep sense of responsibility. They were the first humans to be seen by an intelligence far older and wiser than their own. Every action they took carried weight beyond comprehension. Then one day a change occurred. A pulse arrived from the alien flagship that was longer, stronger, and far more structured than any before. It radiated across the Terran Resolute's hull in waves of light and energy that felt almost tangible. The ship's sensors captured every detail, but interpreting it was a challenge. Analysts quickly noticed patterns embedded within the pulse, sequences that repeated, shifted, and sometimes overlapped. This was no random display. It was deliberate, purposeful, and unmistakably intelligent. The captain called the crew to the observation deck. "We are about to receive a message," they said, voice calm but firm. "Pay close attention. Every observation matters. Humanity's first real communication with another intelligence is happening now." For the first time, the crew felt a sense of awe so profound that it muted their usual focus. They watched as the energy pulse expanded, forming intricate three-dimensional shapes that rotated, folded, and unfolded in ways no human mind could fully grasp. It was as if the fleet was speaking not with words but with mathematics, physics, and something far deeper: intuition, experience, and understanding. The analysts worked frantically to decode the message. Using every tool at their disposal, they mapped the shapes, measured the frequencies, and compared them with previous signals. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Some shapes corresponded to star systems, others to energy flows, and some to principles that seemed almost philosophical in nature. The message was vast, complex, and layered, far beyond simple information. It was a communication of knowledge, a sharing of insight and a subtle test of human comprehension. As hours passed, the meaning became clearer. The Watchers were acknowledging humanity's presence, but more than that, they were offering guidance. The highlighted star systems indicated areas of safety and potential, while darker or inactive regions suggested caution or danger. The energy flows illustrated principles of movement, stability, and balance, lessons in how to navigate space not just physically, but conceptually. The crew realized the significance immediately. The alien fleet had observed countless civilizations over millennia, cataloging those that had survived and those that had vanished. Humanity was now part of that record. The Watchers were not only communicating, they were teaching, warning, and subtly advising. Every pulse, every ripple carried a message of patience, caution, and respect for the universe itself. The captain addressed the crew, voice low but steady. "This is history. We are being acknowledged, but also guided. Treat this knowledge with care. What we learn here could shape the future of humanity for generations." Throughout the following days, the Terran Resolute continued to receive pulses, each one carrying layers of information. Some contained maps of distant systems, including planets and moons with conditions favorable for life. Others conveyed warnings, areas of intense radiation, unpredictable gravitational anomalies, or remnants of civilizations long gone. The complexity of the messages required constant attention, and the crew worked in shifts, deciphering, recording, and learning. Yet the final, most profound pulse had not yet arrived. It came late one night, when most of the crew were gathered quietly on the observation deck. The alien fleet emitted a wave of light that was broader, deeper, and more structured than anything before. It enveloped the Terran Resolute in a shimmering halo, casting shadows across the decks and bathing the crew in a brilliance that was both beautiful and intimidating. The pulse was different this time. It did not contain maps or warnings. It carried a simple, unmistakable acknowledgement. The shapes, sequences, and energy flows combined to form a coherent statement. Humanity is observed. Humanity is recognized. Humanity has the capacity for understanding. It was not a message of dominance, threat, or conquest. It was recognition, pure and simple, from a species that had existed far longer and learned far more than humanity could yet comprehend. The crew felt a wave of emotion that words could not capture. They had witnessed, participated in, and survived a first contact that was neither violent nor chaotic. They had been acknowledged by beings whose intelligence and patience dwarfed their own. And for the first time, humanity understood that it was no longer alone, not just in the solar system but in the wider universe. The captain spoke quietly, almost to themselves. "We have been seen. That is enough to change everything." For the crew, this realization was profound. They understood that humanity's place in the universe was now different. There would be new responsibilities, new expectations, and new challenges, but there was also hope. Hope that humans could grow, learn, and interact with a universe far older and wiser than themselves. Over the next hours, the alien fleet began to retreat slowly, maintaining a deliberate distance. The Watchers were not disappearing. They were leaving the Terran Resolute with space to process, time to reflect, and room to prepare for the next phase of understanding. The ship's sensors recorded every movement, every ripple, and every pulse, ensuring that humanity's first contact would be documented for future generations. The crew gathered on the observation deck in quiet contemplation. The stars stretched endlessly before them, familiar yet transformed by the knowledge that the universe had eyes, awareness, and intelligence that could observe and respond. They realized that the Watcher's final message was not just about recognition. It was about responsibility. Humanity had been noticed, yes, but it had also been measured and evaluated. How humans would act next would define their future. The ship's lead analyst broke the silence. "They've shown us the consequences of curiosity, the rewards of patience, and the importance of restraint. This is more than first contact. It's a lesson in what it means to survive and thrive as a civilization. The captain nodded. And we will carry this lesson home. Every decision we make, every action humanity takes in the future, will be influenced by what we have witnessed here. We have been given knowledge, and knowledge carries responsibility. As the Terran Resolute charted a course back toward safer regions of space, the crew reflected on the enormity of what had occurred. They had faced the unknown, maintained patience and intelligence, and had been recognized by a species that existed far beyond human comprehension. It was not just survival, it was a validation of human potential, an acknowledgement that humanity had the capacity to learn, adapt, and understand. For the first time, the crew allowed themselves to feel something more than caution. Hope. Hope. That humanity could navigate the challenges ahead, that it could grow into a species capable of meeting the Watcher's expectations, and that it could step into the wider universe with confidence and wisdom. And somewhere in the darkness, the alien fleet continued its silent observation. It had tested, measured, and communicated. It had acknowledged humanity's intelligence, patience, and potential, but it had not interfered. It had left humanity with space to reflect, learn, and grow. The universe was no longer a silent expanse. It was alive, aware, and intelligent, and humanity had been seen. The Terran Resolute moved steadily through the void, returning toward the inner solar system. The journey back was calm, almost serene, yet every crew member carried the weight of what had been witnessed. They had been participants in a moment that would define history, a moment that would echo across generations. They had seen the Watchers, understood their message, and survived the first true encounter with an intelligence far older and wiser than themselves. As Earth came into view, the crew prepared to relay the full account of their encounter. The knowledge they had gained, the lessons they had learned, and the proof of intelligent observation would change humanity forever. For the first time, humans understood that the universe was not empty, not silent, and not indifferent. It was intelligent, aware, and capable of recognition. And humanity, for the first time, knew that it had been noticed. The first contact was over, but the implications would continue to unfold. The Watchers had acknowledged humans, shared insight, and demonstrated patience. They had left humanity with knowledge, understanding, and responsibility. The universe had spoken, not with aggression, but with awareness, and humanity had listened. Derbi, crew of the Terran Resolute understood that their mission was only the beginning. The lessons of patience, observation, and restraint would guide humanity as it took its first steps into a wider cosmos. They had been seen, they had been tested, and they